Okay, let's start it. For those of you who came in late, today I probably will talk more. We'll have a less discussion time, I would say, and because the content is kind of dense, I try to cover a lot of things today. So I actually put it into the recording. So you will be able to see if you miss some part of that. Okay, so I'm actually going to start it with asking the first question. Does morality itself has any value? Or we're saying that the value of our morality is nothing to do with the morality itself, but has to do with the consequence the morality was carrying out. Okay, that's the first question I want you to think about. What is there any value? Or sometimes we, in philosophy, we use the term intrinsic value of the morality itself. What do you think? How many of you think that morality does have some value by itself? Raise your hand. Okay, some of you. And what about the other view, which is utilitarianism, which is a focus on the value of the consequence that it carried out? How many of you think that that is the value of morality? Okay, some of you. This is actually a very fundamental question we're going to talk about. We already learned 3 different concepts: relativism, utilitarianism, and deontology. So today we're going to go deep into deontology. And then we're going to see not just about what deontology is, we're going to see some corner cases, the difficult cases, when we apply the concept of deontology. And the thing is that in that process, we also contrast what we understand about deontology in many cases compared to utilitarianism, which the value of morality itself is actually indeed one of the key issues. Okay, so I want to read this part of text to you so you can see that this is the view. By the way, we're talking a lot today. This is the view, moral theory of Immanuel Kant. So this is actually what I wrote here, is actually his word. So let me read it to you. A good will isn't good because of what it affects or accomplishes. It's good in itself, even if by utmost effort the good will accomplishes nothing. It will still shine like a jewel for its own sake, as something which has its full value in itself. Okay, this part of the statement is so important for us to understand what Kant is coming from. It actually associated the value of morality not to the consequence, but to the decision process by each individual one of us when we actually make a moral decision. At the moment we make the decision, the value is done already. And in fact, that is, even though when you make a right decision and the result is totally opposite or create nothing you expected, but the value is still there. Okay, that's what Immanuel Kant tried to emphasize. And this actually will influence essentially the whole lecture. Let's see some interesting cases here. So to actually develop or to understand the moral theory of Kant, as well as many other great thinkers, philosopher in our society, that we have to understand three important elements. That's actually, there are three things we're familiar with, but we're going to see how the three things are going to put together to form the moral framework. There's three elements. The first element is, we already talked about, is called morality. The second element is what we call freedom. The third element is called reason. So three things: morality, freedom, and reason. I mean, if I actually tell you the three words separately, we will all say, okay, we know what it is. And now we're going to see how Kant really means for each of these three terms, and how they actually can put together for us to form the framework we call deontology. Okay, so we already talked about the first thing is called morality. So we say morality has the value. But Kant actually, when he explained morality, he actually focused on one word, because remember, what's the value? The value is when you actually decide to do something before you even see the result. In fact, you will see that Kant cared nothing about the result. He really cared nothing about the result. He just cared the moment you have your motive to do what you want to do. That's the moment we decide the value. Okay, so essentially the value of our action, our decision, is at the time we actually decide what's the motive, the internal process. So this is something I really feel intriguing about what Kant is looking at. It basically is not using morality to judge another person, essentially. If you think about what Kant's morality, in my personal interpretation, is that it's not something I'm going to judge you or you or you, what you're doing is right or wrong. It's actually try to self-examination. It's actually come to our own heart, try to deep through inside of ourselves to actually see what's our motive. And based on that, we actually decide whether our motive is aligned with the definition that's actually given by Kant. So he actually contrasts two kinds of motive. The first kind of motive is essentially deontology. The second kind of motive is essentially utilitarianism. Okay, essentially, the mastermind of utilitarianism was actually developed a little bit earlier than Immanuel Kant, a little bit earlier, but they actually overlap, they know each other, and they actually come out with this moral theory for Kant to develop something to actually address the things he feels not sufficient or not right for utilitarianism. So what is duty versus inclination? So inclination is essentially saying that you're doing something because of some external reason or forces that you make that decision. That's inclination. I mean, how many of you drink soda yesterday? I'm just using an example, okay? Drink soda. Do you think that you sometimes feel that you have the desire, you feel thirsty, you really like that, you drink some soda, right? I mean, if you look at advertisement, they always kind of provide some kind of inclination for you to happily consume some kind of soft drink or any kind of drink, right? So the thing is that what's happening there is that when we make different kinds of decisions, we always being attracted or being incentivized by some of the outside element, outside our heart to do so. In some sense, to be honest with you, you'll see this a lot later, is that in fact, our mind, our heart has been influenced already as we grow up. Depending on which family you were with initially, depending on your earlier education. When you come to UC Davis, you are not, how do I say that, a piece of white paper. You are the result of your experience over the past how many years. And we actually will see some of the really nice video called Lottery of Births, which we will go into that a lot deeper, okay? But the thing is that that inclination means that we already deviate ourselves from a very neutral, very pure position. Okay, that is actually pretty hard to understand, but basically a lot of our decision is based on inclination. So now it's actually, this is the purpose of this course, is actually try to identify that element in our life and such that we will be self-awareness, and then we will actually look at the other part of motive. It's called motive of duty. So motive of duty is essentially that there's something that's actually right. In fact, the motive of inclination is implying that there's a no absolute moral value. Because depending on the situation, you can do this or do that. But motive of duty is essentially saying that there's a something which is absolute. There's something in this world, there's a principle that's actually going to be unchanged, permanent. And based on that, we make a decision. So essentially, motive of duty is actually try to act, decide based on nothing else, but internally from your heart about what's right and wrong. So that's really Kant strive for what that's the morality, and that's actually the value. In fact, he even further associate is that capability differentiate human being and say all the other animals. That's essentially, that's why the whole ethics and morality is really human-centric about how we develop that. Okay, that's the idea about motives or morality. Okay, so now I want to actually just make some enhancement on what I said. So when we actually dealing with things, usually we have multiple motives. We have multiple motives. For example, you come to the class today because you want to learn, right? You want to learn. That's the duty, because you know learning something is good for enriching yourself to make a contribution to the world. But the thing is that you also have to come to the class. That's actually, otherwise, Professor Wu will deduct your points because you actually didn't make them. So you see that you have a mixed number of motives in your mind. So essentially, in the Immanuel Kant's theory, is saying that, well, as long as the dominating, the primary motive is the motive of duty, I think it's okay for you to have other duty. You essentially is leading by this motive, but you accomplish other motives as well. Okay, so that's just want to clarify the first one. Okay, so this will lead to the second part, the definition of freedom. So why this is important is because, and why they're related. I'm not going to ask you what's your definition of freedom. So when you want to differentiate yourself from the motives of duty versus motive of inclination, which means that you have to resist the temptation. I mean, I'm not saying drinking soda is bad, I'm just using this as an example, okay? You actually resist the temptation of actually following your desire to do something. And the thing is that that is the definition of freedom in Kant's theory. So essentially what we're saying is that the freedom is not because you can do something. The freedom in Kant is that you have the capacity to overcome your desire to actually do something that's actually triggered by external. Okay, that's the definition of freedom. So essentially, we are actually have a heart. We decide what's right and wrong, and which we'll get to that. How your heart actually decide what's right and wrong. That's another thing. That's the third thing we need to talk about. But the thing is that you also get influenced by outside. I mean, for example, I'm actually influencing you right now. Think about that. I'm influencing you by saying things. And your freedom is actually provide critical thinking on every sentence I said and try to see which part of the whatever Professor Wu's lecture is actually wrong or is actually should not influence your behavior because you have your mission, your decision to make. Okay, so you can see that we're actually living in the world. We have so much influence. We have the influence from the news. That's why we're going to have a fake news. And we have all the media, we have all kinds of food. When you go into Costco, see how much temptation each one of us actually need to face. But the freedom of determination of will, it's very critical that we need to have the freedom to actually be able to separate this so we can actually make a decision. Basically, is provide a motive of duty. Okay, so I want to actually go in this a little bit. So there are two words. One is called autonomous or autonomy. That is meaning that you can actually make an autonomous decision regardless any kind of outside influence. And that is important because without that, you cannot actually make a motive of duty. You will always fall into the inclination. So this word actually compared to the other word, which I never have used this word until I taught this course. It's called heteronomy. Heteronomy is basically meaning, I mean, some of you probably never saw this word, so I provide a definition, is that heteronomy is a lack of moral freedom of self-determination. Okay, so that's the contrast. Okay, so this leads to some question, which we don't have time to do discussion, but I want to just say that to you, and then you can answer the question without going to the break room. The question first is, of course, are we really free? We're really free today. Think about that. When I'm saying free, it's not our physical freedom, means we can go from Boehner to Kemper or to somewhere else. It's about our heart, our mind. Are we really free? This is a self-awareness process. To be honest with you, I myself feel I had some bad influence in the past, which is also my fault. But that experience turned out sometime make me a person that cannot make the best decision based on motive of duty. I got influenced. So I think this is normal. Everybody needs to get to that process, which we will talk more on the third element. But now the second question, more important I'd like to discuss, is that why is lying is always unethical? So we talk about the case of Tony, Elvira, and the murderer, right? Remember that whether Elvira should lie. And we had a really fun discussion last time. But let's not talk about this question in general. Let's talk about this question in Kant's moral theory. Why is lying unethical? Anybody? Why is lying unethical? Yes, please.
Because you intend to deceive someone.
Right, because, thank you. What's your name?
Matthias.
Matthias. Matthias is saying that because we deceive someone. And the thing is, what happened is that when we deceive someone, we actually, there are two things. Number one, we actually influence that person in the wrong way. So we're actually making the other person's, what I call the capability of freedom, got affected because they got the wrong information. In fact, here I want to actually say another thing is that in the whole Kant framework, it's very important to actually respect humanity, respect everybody else, because they need to make a moral decision. They need to have all the support they need. And therefore, by lying, we essentially influence that capability in a negative way. Of course, there's other reason, which now we go to the third one is called reason. So we talk about the first two, they are pretty abstract. The first one just basically say, hey, we believe the value is here, not there. That's what the morality definition of the first one is not consequence, is at the time you make a decision, right? That's the first one. And the second one is just bring self-awareness into each one of us to know that we actually need to have that kind of freedom in order to make the decision for the first element, the morality. Okay, that's the two elements. But ultimately, we still are limbo in terms of what's right, what's wrong. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we still need to make a decision. We still need to make this morality hit the real world problem we're dealing with. And therefore, we need to do some kind of reasoning. And by the way, that reasoning is the capacity that each one of us need to have when you have freedom. By the way, if you don't have freedom in the second one, you cannot do this right. You might be able to do a little bit. That's why these two are related. When you're freedom, then you can start to apply your reasoning. And the thing is that to describe this reasoning, Kant provide, in fact, 4 imperatives. So Monday, you already see 2 of them. And today I'm going to cover the third one. And there is a 4th one, which I'll cover later in the quarter. Okay, the 4th one is the least popular, and it's actually dealing with some of the society issue. So it's interesting when we see some real case. But right now, I'm going to actually cover the 3 things. So, so imperative has 2 kinds of imperative: categorical imperative and hypothetical imperative. So let me first tell you what is a hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperatives basically say, as I put down here, if you desire X, you should actually do Y. That's hypothetical. That's essentially there's a causality, there's an inclination. Because you want to get good grade, so you want to actually work hard. That seems okay, right? But it might, according to the Kant, it's nothing to the consequence. Anything to the consequence, I have to say that, because as an instructor, of course, I want you to work hard for the good grade, right? But the thing is that in Kant, when we want to listen, we want to go deeper into your heart. And why you're doing that, I mean, the first question I want to ask is, why do you want to get good grade? Is good grade is your ultimate goal, or there is other motive that's actually need to be on top of that? Okay, so you can have a multiple motives, as I mentioned, but the thing is that what is the primary one? If you let getting good grade become your primary one, then actually the learning process might not be the ideal. But you see, I'm actually falling into the trap of consequentialism because I'm actually looking about the impact. So it's really about motive. This is very tricky. That's why I say this lecture is quite dense. It may include a lot of concepts which most of the computer science and engineering students, you never got a chance to actually expose to. But we want to make sure that you got exposed at least once before you graduate from UC Davis. Okay, so now we talk about the imperative. It's really categorical imperative. So categorical, the word basically say this is absolute. This is nothing to do with any like X, so you have to do Y. It's just Y itself. So that's why it's categorical. So there are, I mentioned about 4, but I'm going to talk about this 3 today. Universality, I always hard to pronounce because there are many different words by different philosophers. And the second one is humanity. The third one, I'm actually going to talk about the self-legislation. So let me just repeat what is universality. So universality is that if you think that lying is ethical, then we apply. So universality is really a check, a test. For us, it's not a principle that we're going to follow, but it's a reasoning. We're going to check whatever we're doing is actually ethical or not. So, for example, I said earlier, is lying ethical? Let me actually just apply this rule. I said, okay, lying is indeed ethical. Then I universalize. I'm saying that, is that true in any kind of situation, in any people, we can always lie because it is ethical. So they do this kind of logical analysis and basically say, because it cannot be universalized, and therefore it's not ethical. Okay, so that's the rule of universality. Okay, the second one is humanity, is essentially saying that we are actually treating each of the human being as the end, not as the mean. So essentially, I'm actually not, for example, I'm not using this opportunity to actually do a favor to somebody else and expecting something in return. So that's if I'm doing that, then I'm treating human as a mean, not as an end. Okay, so I'm not going to go deep into that. If you look at what happened last week, Monday, you actually get some idea about that. Okay, so we now have 2 things covered, 2 categorical imperative. Number 1 is actually universality. Number 2 is humanity. Let's take a look at what these 2 did to us. So these 2 are essentially saying that we have a way to check whether something is ethical or something unethical. And the second one is always check when we interact with all the people, including ourselves. By the way, humanity, including ourselves. So essentially, in Kant's theory, if you murder somebody or you commit suicide, it's the same category. It's the same situation because you actually are treating yourself as a mean by killing yourself and try to accomplish something, say your frustration or your sadness, your desperation. Okay, so the thing is that just let you know that that's a humanity. That humanity could be anybody else, but very important. One lesson you need to learn here is that you need to treat yourself good as well. Okay, so that's the humanity. Okay, the third one is self-legislation. Is that okay? So when I say lying is bad, I'm using universality. Does that also mean that everybody or the majority of people already believe that lying is bad, right? I mean, what happens if we are living in a world, everybody believes that lying is good? And how does human society move from knowing nothing, being born, to a point that most of us don't believe killing is good? Most of us don't believe that lying is good. Most of us don't believe something else is bad. Okay, so how do we actually build that up so we can have that? That is actually this imperative called self-legislation. So essentially what we have is that this is actually very important imperative differentiate us from everything else. Is that we actually develop a set of rules So the difference between Kant and utilitarianism is essentially there is an outside law. That law is called economy. That law is a utility function that's actually developed and calculate what's right, what's wrong, what's the maximize the most amount of happiness. And therefore, we just basically act according to that utility function. So we're inclined to that utility function to react. So that's utilitarianism. But in the ontology, every single one of us is autonomous. Remember I said there's no influence from outside. So meaning that you need to develop the legislation to yourself. You need to develop the law to yourself. And with some help, like universality, but even universality, before it can work, you must actually develop some law within yourself as a community. So essentially, this is a fantastic place that I found that the Kant theory is both theoretical, but it's very interesting. It's actually saying that the human being, he's saying that human being has this capability, has this capacity. Once you are free, once you have the freedom, you can do critical thinking, you can examine things around your world, even we never talk. We're going to build some capacity about morality over our self-interest. So what's self-interest? I want to drink soda, I want to do this, I want to do that. But freedom means that I'm still have those interests, but I'm not going to be completely shadowed by those influence, and I can actually do independent thinking, freedom. So that is actually the intrinsic value, means that somehow under Kant theory that each one of us is going to develop that capability. And it turned out that our moral value will be exactly the same on a few things. So that's actually very important. Of course, I mean, now you probably know my research is a fake news. And now I actually worry about if that is actually I want to follow, then fake news is very important because fake news or lying is actually going to causing a lot of trouble for people to be able to build toward that universal imperative for us to be able to act morally. Okay, that's actually what we have. Okay, I want to pause just a moment before we actually go to some discussion. Any question at this moment about morality, freedom, and the reason, and also this 3 categorical imperative? Any question from remote? Yes, please.
I think that so basically for universality, you said like in a general term, like for example, lying is bad. So that's for like a universal law. And then humanity is basically acting good towards other people and yourself. And then for self-legislation, could you repeat one more time?
Okay, so lying is bad, right? The reason lying is bad is from universal lies concept is that if I ask 100 people, I ask them whether lying is bad, I cannot get 100 people all tell me that lying is good. That's universal, means that if I'm actually killing, how do I know actually killing is bad? Because I'm actually looking around the world for all the people, and basically majority of them is actually going to tell me killing is bad. But how does those majority people actually even possess the concept that lying is bad or killing is bad? And that is what this 3rd imperative is going to help us develop. Self-legislation, because we need to develop a set of rules for self. This is essentially saying that when we grow up, we build up our values. We build up our principle, our integrity about how we actually going to do things. And that is not something, so yes, we do get influence. We do get influence. And some of the influence you can imagine is actually deviate from some of the value, depending on which area you grow up, what religions and things like that. And what we're saying is that when you have the freedom, you really have the true freedom, which is number two. Sorry, number two is over there, which is the freedom is the called determination or will. When you have the freedom, you start to have the capacity to override those influences. The influence still exists, but you start to challenge those influence. If the influence, and through that process, you build up your law. And through that process, I actually realized lying is bad, or killing person is definitely not something I should be doing, unless for some special reason. That's why it's it's very important. It's a process that we have to do. So self-legislation basically saying that we have to build a set of law to ourselves. We don't, like utilitarianism, we follow a law. I mean, later we talk about the other concept called social contract, which is not today. It's essentially a society maybe actually impose some of the law. But Kant is saying that we need to build that law ourselves to be, yeah. How do you actually develop that? You through the freedom. Okay,
Thank you.
right? They're related, very, very deep. Okay, thank you for your question. Okay, so I'm actually going to ask you a question now. The group discussion. I'm going to separate you into just talk about this because you can see that we all got influenced by something when we grow up. I mean, each of the person, including myself in this room, we have story from the moment we were born until the moment we walk into this classroom. Each one of us has a story. And that story is actually shaping us about who we are today. I want you to actually just talk about that, but in a confidential manner, because obviously you're going to share something which is confidential. Number one, this course, we want to be really confidential, keep the detail. The scribe, you can actually just record something very high level. If you don't record anything for this question, I'm fine as well. Okay, I want to make sure that your confidentiality, privacy is more important than anything else. Okay, I want you to actually spend some time. Maybe we give ourselves 5 minutes. Okay, yeah, go ahead. A remote student, I'm going to open the room now. Okay, you have 3 minutes, okay?
All those things have I guess, yeah, that's
Okay, 1 minute.
Yeah.
White lie is also lie. I can hear you. White lie is also lie. Yeah. I mean, the white lie is actually intent to consequentialism, try to do something good, right? But remember, Kant is looking at your motive. If that is actually lying already in that motive, it's actually going to be. We'll see some interesting example. Now everybody's back. So I'm going to ask you the question between these two. What's the reason? What's the difference between lying and misleading? But I'm speaking the truth. You know the difference? Lying, basically, I'm telling something which is not factual, regardless it's lie or white lie. But misleading is that I'm actually telling the truth, but I kind of lure some of the people to actually misunderstand something. But on the other hand, in the ontology, that's motive. That's actually in my mind about what's my motive. So in general, we cannot just say, you're still telling the truth, right? You're doing the same thing. But the motive is going to be different. But lying is definitely wrong according to the ontology. But how about misleading? Let me actually show you some video, and then we'll see that. It's very interesting, a little bit disturbing case. Sorry about that. I believe it's here. Okay.
Of a clever evasion that is strictly speaking true. This raises the question whether there is a moral difference between an outright lie and a misleading truth. From Kant's point of view, there actually is a world of difference between a lie and a misleading truth. Why is that? Even though both might have the same consequences. But then remember, Kant doesn't base morality on consequences. He bases it on formal adherence to the moral law. Now, sometimes in ordinary life, we make exceptions for the general rule against lying with a white lie. What is a white lie? It's a lie to avoid hurting someone's feelings, for example. It's a lie that we think of as justified by the consequences. Now, Kant could not endorse a white lie, but perhaps he could endorse a misleading truth. Suppose someone gives you a tie as a gift, and you open the box, and it's just awful. What do you say? Thank you. You could say thank you, but they're waiting to see what you think of it. or they ask you, what do you think? You could tell a white lie and say, it's beautiful. But that wouldn't be permissible from Kant's point of view. Could you say, not a white lie, but a misleading truth? You open the box and you say, I've never seen a tie like that before. Thank you. You shouldn't have. Can you think of a contemporary political leader who engaged?
Okay, so now I'm going to, in fact, you can, for the case that we talk about in the Elvera Tony's case, Elvera could potentially say a misleading truth. That is actually the suggestion from this discussion, that you can potentially do that. But now he actually mentioned there was a contemporary political leader. Let me actually show you a piece of video. And let me, I want you to say whether you think that this is my last question.
While this was worthy of the nation's highest office, Ronald Reagan's speech, 12 years later, on this day in 1998, a scandal of sex and lies marked a low point for the White House.
It was the day President Bill Clinton said words that would follow him and his wife for years to come. Scott Pelley reports.
Tonight, Monica Lewinsky's attorneys tell us that she has told prosecutors all she knows. They describe what they call a complete account of her relationship with President Clinton. But that account was given over the telephone today and was not written down. Prosecutors are still trying to decide whether they will offer immunity. This new threat came on the same day that the president finally rallied to his own defense. The president had been silent 3 days. His lawyers wanted it that way. But the political damage was rising much too fast. Today, drawn and bleary-eyed, Mr. Clinton joined the battle to save his presidency.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky. I never told anybody it's a lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
He turned his back on.
Okay, so I want to ask you, this is my last question I want to ask you. Do you believe was President Clinton lying or not lying? What's your thought? By the way, people actually wrote a 33 pages academic paper. Let me actually show you this paper. I want to show you this paper, not this paper. Where's the paper? This paper, you see that? This paper has 33 pages. And talk about the Clinton lie defining sexual relation.
Oh,
So for the interest of time, according to the law, President Clinton was doing misleading. Depending on the definition of sexual relationship, I don't want to go into the detail about the definition, it's too graphical, and I don't think it's necessary, but I can just give you an example that in that definition, giving certain sexual act will not consider as a sexual relationship. Sorry, giving a sexual act to your partner is considered sexual relationship, but receiving is not, was not, according to that definition. So he's very cleverly doing a, how do I say that? A misleading in this example. In fact, when I look at this case, I feel I'm still having, even myself as an instructor, I still have problem to actually accepting that misleading is actually dramatically different from Immanuel Kant's perspective than that. So just to let you know that this is interesting. I'm going to show you the rest of the video from the lecture. So you will see what's going on.
You can? Who are you thinking of? Remember the whole carefully worded denials in the Monica Lewinsky affair of Bill Clinton. Now, those denials actually became the subject of very explicit debate and argument during the impeachment hearings. Take a look at the following excerpts from Bill Clinton. Is there something, do you think, morally at stake in the distinction between a lie and a misleading, carefully couched truth?
I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false.
Did he lie to the American people when he said, I never had sex with that woman?
You know, he doesn't believe he did, and because of the. Let me explain, Congressman. What he said was to the American people that he did not have sexual relations. And I understand you're not going to like this, Congressman, because you will see it as a hair-splitting, evasive answer. But in his own mind, his definition was not.
Okay, I understand that argument.
Okay.
All right. So there you have the exchange. Now, at the time, you may.
Okay, this is what I call the corner case of the ontology. That's actually very interesting, and for us to think about this more. So what you learn from this lecture is just understand basic definition of the ontology, utilitarianism, and relativism. But on the other hand, I would say that in our application in real life, we have to just continue to apply this freedom for us to decide, to build up those principles and remind ourselves of duty. And from that process, we actually will be able to make a better moral decision. Okay, I will see you on Friday.
Thank you.